Hey everybody, today we're debating who was Jesus, and we're starting right now. Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have you here for this epic debate. So, if this is your first time here, I want to say a few things. Whether you be Christian, pagan, atheist, you name it, we are glad you're here. We hope you feel welcome. And by the way, consider hitting that subscribe button if you love debates and would like reminders of future debates, including Destiny versus Vosh in person this March, as well as many others. We are very excited. Today's going to be an epic one, folks. I am honestly thrilled. So what we are going to do here is it's going to be a roughly 6 to 8 minute opening statement if the speaker would like one, and then after we get that from each of our four speakers laying out their general case, we'll go into open discussion. They can defer if they would like, in other words, basically if they're like, I'll just maybe give you like 60 seconds, lay out my case, and that's it. That's up to them. They're welcome to do that as well. But otherwise, like I said, they had that 6 to 8, and then we'll go into open convo. Do want to let you know as well, folks, their links are in the description. So if you're listening and you're like, I want more, I need to hear more from him, well, great news. You conveniently can by just looking below down there in that little description box. You can pull up their link and see more of their content. So with that, thrilled to have you here. Gentlemen, thanks so much. This is a real treat. And I love that I told them beforehand, I said, I love that we get to see your guys' beautiful faces. We get to see your reactions. I think that just makes it more engaging, more fun to kind of get to see you guys react to each other as we go through the discussion. So with that, we'll go from left to right. We'll give Jonathan McLatchie the first opening, followed by Nathaniel, the Veritopian, and then John. So thanks so much again for being here, gentlemen. And Jonathan, the floor is all yours.
Well, thanks so much, James. Great to be here. Thanks for all who've agreed to participate in today's discussion. It's a very important topic, and I'm very looking forward to an engaging dialogue. I am a Christian, and I'm a very staunch evidentialist, meaning that I am a Christian because I'm persuaded by the public evidence that Christianity is objectively true. I believe that the historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth is very well established by an avalanche of confirmatory data. I believe that you can make a very robust case for the substantial reliability of the gospel biographies concerning the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth. There's various categories of evidence which I think avail to establish the substantial credibility of the gospel records. One of those is a phenomenon which has come to be called undesigned coincidences in the Gospels. And this basically is when sometimes two works by different authors interlock in a way that would be very unlikely if one of them were copied from the other, or both were copied from a common source. For example, one book may mention in passing in detail the answer to some question raised by the other. The two records fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So let's take an example. Turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 6. We have the setup for the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. When we get to verse 5 of John 6, it says, lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where would you buy bread so these people may eat? And it immediately raises the question in the mind of the audience, why does Jesus turn to Philip here on this occasion? Why not say Judas Iscariot, who's in charge of the money bag, or someone like that? Then we turn over to Luke's account, the parallel account of the feeding of the 5,000. And he writes in Luke chapter 9, verse 10 and 11, on their return, the apostles told him all they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a tent of Bethsaida. When the crowds learned it, they followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing. So, and then we flip over to John again, John chapter 12, 6 chapters after the feeding of the 5,000 narrative, completely different context, completely different Passover festival being celebrated. And John mentions that there were some Greeks at the festival who wanted to speak to Jesus. So verse 21 says, they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, sir, we wish to see Jesus. So here in a very incidental off-the-cuff remark, John mentions that Philip's hometown is Bethsaida in Galilee. Then putting the pieces together from Luke 9, John 6, and John 12, Luke doesn't mention Philip in this context at all in Luke chapter 9. He just mentions that the event taking place in Bethsaida, but he doesn't have Philip playing a part in that narrative. John's account doesn't mention Bethsaida as the setting of the miracle story, but does mention Jesus speaking to Philip. And it's only when you get to John 12 that we learn that Philip is from the town of Bethsaida in Galilee. And so by putting the pieces together, we have a cogent picture that explains why Jesus speaks to Philip in John 6:5, because he's a local character and knows where the shops are to buy bread. That's something that's very difficult. That's something that forgeries are not like this, right? Where you have these interlocking puzzle pieces that illuminate and confirm one another. Now, it turns out that we have numerous examples of such undesigned coincidences crisscrossing documents. Take one more example. In John chapter 12, we read in verse 1 and 2, 6 days before Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany where Lazarus was, and Jesus had raised from the dead, so they gave a dinner for him there. Now, John's gospel is the only gospel that gives us that timestamp of Jesus approaching Bethany 6 days before Passover. And verse 12 says that Jesus enters Jerusalem on the back of a donkey the following day, so 5 days before Passover, a detail, again, which is extraneous to the Gospel of John and not found in any other Gospels account. If we turn over to the Gospel of Mark, we can actually find the 6 days that John speaks of in Mark's Gospel, even though Mark does not give us that same timestamp of when Jesus approached Bethany. Mark chapter 11, verse 1. When they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village in front of you, and immediately as you enter it, you'll find a colt tied on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it." So Mark actually telescopes the narrative in that he doesn't mention that Jesus actually approached Bethany the night before, and in the morning he sent the disciples to fetch the colt, and he rode into Jerusalem. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that John is correct, that Jesus did in fact approach Bethany 6 days before Passover and enters Jerusalem 5 days before Passover. Well, when we get to verse 11 of Mark 11, it says, "He entered Jerusalem and went into the temple, and when he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. This would therefore be the evening 5 days before Passover, assuming the chronology of John to be correct. Then turn over to verse 12 of the same chapter. It says, "On the following day, when he came from Bethany, he was hungry." And so if John's chronology is correct, that would make it the morning of 4 days before Passover. And then we get to verse 19, when evening came, they went out of the city, the evening of 4 days before Passover. Then we turn to verse 20. As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. That would make it the morning of 3 days before Passover. Then in chapter 13 of Mark, you have what's called the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus has a conversation with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives is midway between Jerusalem, where he's been all day, and Bethany, where his accommodation is for the night. And so we can assume fairly, I think, that this is the evening of 3 days before Passover, assuming the chronology of John again to be correct. Then we turn over to chapter 14 of Mark, verse 1. It was now 2 days before the Passover. It synchronizes exactly as you would expect, given the assumption that John's chronology is correct, that Jesus really did approach Bethany 6 days before Passover and entered Jerusalem 5 days before Passover. A very specific detail, which, and John gives us loads of very specific details, many of which are not found in the other 3 Gospels. And in many of these cases, such as the 2 we examined, we can actually confirm those specific details, which gives us a level of confidence for those specific details that John gives us that we cannot directly verify or cross-check. There's other sorts of patterns in the Gospels which I think avail to show the substantial reliability of the reports. For example, the phenomenon of unexplained allusions in Scripture. Mark 15:21, for example, when Jesus is carrying his cross to his execution site, it says, "They compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross." Well, who are Alexander and Rufus? We don't know. They're just name dropped, like the reader's supposed to know who they are. And presumably they were people who were known to the original audiences, but we don't necessarily know who they are today. But the fact that we have this unexplained allusion to these individuals, Alexander and Rufus, who are not relevant in any way to the story, lends, I think, credibility to the account. So there's just a couple of examples of patterns in the Gospels which establish or confirm the reliability of the Gospel accounts. And if indeed the Gospels and Acts are indeed based on the testimony of credible eyewitnesses who are habitually truthful and honest reporters of the events that they narrate, and were close up to the facts, then we have to take seriously what they say concerning the nature and variety of the post-resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus experienced by the apostles, including the fact that it was multi-sensory, involving not just sight, but group conversations, physical contact, even breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, physical contact, etc., group conversations. Also, as it extends across 40 days, not one brief and confusing episode. We have to take seriously that goes back to the early apostolic community. And that's the sort of thing that's very difficult to be wrong about. So it argues against the hypothesis that the disciples were honestly mistaken in their reportage. And so the fact that they're willing to suffer for that belief also militates strongly against the hypothesis that they were deliberately lying. And so I think that the best explanation for the resurrection evidence is that Jesus of Nazareth really did rise from the dead, thus vindicating his messianic and divine self-claims. And I'll close at that. Thank you.
You bet. Just in time. So thanks so much, Jonathan. And same with Nathaniel. Very excited to hear your opening statement as well. The floor is all yours. I got the timer set.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. It really is an honor to be here. I was invited here earlier this morning, and so I have not had much of a chance to write a lot of stuff, but I made some notes, and so I'm just going to go ahead and go from there. I'm not a mythicist, not in any stretch of the imagination. I believe that Jesus definitely existed, and I believe that I can show that to be true beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's actually in opposition of my girlfriend. So this is one area where she's wrong, which is kind of nice because I'm probably wrong about everything else, and she's sitting over there. So that'll be a fun conversation when we're done here. But I do believe that Jesus existed. We have independent attestation in both the New Testament with Mark, Q, M, and L, as well as John, as well as extra biblically with Josephus, and these are all in the 1st century. So I think that it would be a grave mistake to state that Jesus did not exist historically. Now, of course, with that being said, this does not mean that the stories written about Jesus in the New Testament are true. In fact, I would state that probably not. I agree with the near unanimous view of New Testament scholars who would state that that the 4 Gospels are incredibly they're anonymous. They're certainly not first person. They even tell us that. The book of Luke, very specifically, in the first verse of the 1st chapter, states that he's not an eyewitness, and we don't know who wrote the books. We don't know if they're secondhand, thirdhand, or where even they were when they wrote them. The first that we have, which would be the book of Mark in around 70 CE, it's certainly not written in Palestine. And this is with it being the book that is the closest to the events, is the one that we would consider to be most accurate. And that one gets basic geography wrong. So with that being stated, how reliable can we consider the Gospels? Well, this is where we actually talk about Jesus. Did Jesus consider himself to be the Messiah? I believe he did. However, I don't think that Jesus believed he was God. And therein lies the difference. And I believe that John can actually attest to the fact that the Messiah in the Jewish tradition wouldn't have been God. It depends what divinity means in the sects of religion, which is an important detail that we should discuss, maybe in possibly another segment. The specific question and the purpose of this is, did Jesus believe that he was God? And did Jesus rise from the dead? And I believe that both of those are no. We have to turn to the only source for the purported words of Jesus, and that's the New Testament. While Paul wrote more of the 27 books, probably about 7 of the 13 that are attested to him, he did not meet Jesus while he was alive. It's important to note, while Paul considered Jesus God, in the sense, by the way, that he considered Jesus to be an angel as part of God and not God incarnate, and I believe that I can actually provide attestation for that as well, we have to look at the actual claims in the New Testament. And the way that we're able to do that, to look at Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, we have the criterion. And the 3 historical criterion that we look at are the criterion of dissimilarity, of dissimilarity, the criterion of contextual credibility, and independent attestation. Now, independent attestation is considering the authenticity of a claim by attempting to locate a story or tradition in multiple sources. These sources should be contemporary to or close to the time of the supposed events. Are they? Are the Gospels contemporary to or close to the time of the supposed events? No, they are not. John, the last of them, and not even one of the synoptic Gospels, was written between 90 and 95 CE, while the minority of scholars would even say that it was written at the end of the 1st century. Are the claims independent of one another? Well, Matthew was written after Mark and copied about 95% of Mark. Luke was written after Matthew and copied a large chunk of Matthew, and thus about 53% of Mark. This means that neither Luke nor Matthew, in that sense, are independent sources. Anything that is found in Matthew but not the other Gospels came from a different source. Let's call it M. And the same can be said for Luke, which is L. The sayings of Jesus, or the saying source, come from the gospel, or the she'll call it the source called Q. And John was independent of all of those. So we could say Mark, M, L, Q, and John are the only sources for Jesus that we have. Any claim that's made in just one source, which is further from the events, is most likely to be considered inaccurate, or is least likely to be considered accurate. John contains more unique claims about Jesus and his ministry than any of the other gospels, making it the most dependently attested of the four, meaning it's the least reliable, and it's the only one in which Jesus said empirically, I am God, which means with all of those claims that it is most unlikely that Jesus claimed to be God. This lends credence to us not accepting what is said in the Gospel of John, especially when it comes to Jesus. Now, the messianic figure was only considered somebody who was anointed. The followers of Jesus, who I do believe existed for the most part, would not have believed that Jesus was going to rise from the dead. We know that because in all four books that we have in the Bible, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, zero of either the women or the men that went to the tomb automatically said Jesus rose from the dead. That means the empty tomb, and I know that Hunter will disagree with me here, that means the empty tomb, because it did not convince anybody, cannot be considered evidence from when something happened. It was only after the fact where Jesus appeared to people. And this, of course, was not even necessarily in a bodily form, as we can find in more than one of the Gospels. So this could be anything from a vision to anything that one or two people, and in my case, I believe that Peter and Mary Magdalene had visions of Jesus when he out of bereavement, out of a type of hallucination, which, by the way, is incredibly common. The sources don't corroborate either, for the most part. When we look at the gospel accounts, they don't corroborate, beginning with Matt. Well, Mark doesn't even talk about the birth of Jesus. And of course, it doesn't even have a resurrection story outside of why are you looking for the dead among the living, why are you looking for the living among the dead? But it starts from the very beginning when the genealogies are incorrect. But I would say that there's nothing outside of the Gospels that says that Jesus rose from the dead. There are contradictory reports inside of the Gospels that say when Jesus rose from the dead, how Jesus rose from the dead, what he looked like, if he could be touched, where he met the disciples, how long he was on earth, the miracles that he supposedly performed, when he ascended to heaven, if he ascended to heaven. We need to talk to Luke about that one and wonder where he got his information from that. And then we have to look at it and say, where is the other independent attestation? Where is the extra biblical attestation? We don't have that. We don't have it at all. We also don't have any idea what happened to the disciples or the apostles after that. We don't know what happened to Paul and Peter. Sure, there's the tradition that comes from Tacitus, written in the 2nd century, but we actually can say that, why would he say in 64 that Nero went after the Christians when the word Christian wasn't even invented in 64? And so we have a lot of church tradition that says these things, but we don't have any kind of independent extra biblical attestation that Jesus would have been anything other than an itinerant Jewish rabbi who considered himself the Messiah with 12 disciples, who he was going to be anointed by God. And he was going to, when the Son of Man did come back, that he was going to have his 12 disciples to rule the 12 tribes of Israel, and that he was going to be the king over all of those at the end of the next age. And there was nothing more that we can say about Jesus. We know that because the book of Mark shows him in agony when he was contemplating the death that he was certainly going to have come upon him very soon. So no, I think that Jesus existed, but I don't think there's any other reason to consider him anything other than a regular itinerant Jewish rabbi. Thanks.
You got it. Thanks so much, Nathaniel. Appreciate that. Right in time as well. And now we'll kick it over to would it be fair? I want to make sure that if I've given you the wrong title, Veritopian, forgive me. I had put pagan, but if there's another word, I can put that word in for you. So, but in any case, we're honored to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, James. No, pagan will do. It'll do. Pagan's a very broad church. So, I mean, some of the things that I believe are not necessarily what other pagans will believe. So, pagan will do. My position is that Jesus did exist, but I would dispute his name, his location, and his date, and also Christians' understanding of who Jesus was and his purpose. I would speculate that he probably was the Jewish Messiah as well. So let's get into it. To understand Jesus, you have to understand the Bible as a whole. And from my understanding, the two most important people in the Bible are Cain and Jesus. So everyone knows the story of Cain and Abel, but the story of Cain is really that of the kingmakers. So Cain is the same word as king. Cain is Cohen, Khan, king, and so Cain. I'm sorry, this is my first live stream. I'm a bit nervous.
No
I've never done this before. And do I sound okay? I sound a bit croaky to myself, and I can't hear myself properly as well. Do I sound okay?
No, we've got you just right in the zone for like good volume level.
Okay, good. Okay, so the Bible, it's an interesting book, but it's quite ambiguous. It can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. So I would look at the general themes of the Bible and the characters therein and the spirit of the book rather than the kind of the details of it. I would see Adam and Eve as not being the first people on the planet, rather, many people have talked about Adam and Eve as being a tribe, so it's kind of ambiguous in that sense as well. But if there were an Adam and Eve and they did have a son, Cain, so they must have been a couple of people. At some point, there must have been some people who turned away from the natural law, which is what Adam and Eve did. The story of Adam and Eve is the story of how immorality came into the world. They were the first people who turned away from God's natural law and decided to take the knowledge of good and evil for themselves, which is essentially to be immoral, to have your own morality that is different from God's. So anyway, obviously Adam and Eve in the story, they had two children, Cain and Abel, and Cain killed Abel. So if nothing else, Adam and Eve were terrible parents. They really just, they obviously didn't bring their children up right, if that was how it turned out. So the eldest son killed his brother. And then Cain, I've got a quote somewhere. So when Cain was cursed by God, he said, "You will be a restless wanderer in the earth," and he was cast away or whatever. Cain was given the mark of Cain in the next verse. But subsequently, so this is in verse 12 of Genesis 4. But by verse 17, Cain was then building a city. So he was no longer a wanderer in the earth. He was a city builder. He was a king. He was essentially enslaving other people to work for him. And the story of the Bible is really the story of the city builders, the kings who were clever enough to have the ability to control the minds of the ordinary people through, very clever mind control devices, which we call religions today, in order to extract their value, their work, to turn them into slaves, essentially. So this is what Cain was doing, Cain the murderer, and he was turning people into slaves. Now, I did a little research a while ago about Noah. I was wondering, because we assume that Noah came from the good line. We've got Adam and Eve, and they gave rise to Cain and Seth. And it's supposed that Noah came from Seth, who wasn't a murderer. But if you actually look into the genealogy of it, it turns out that that's not as simple as you might think. And I did an article a little while ago on the genealogy of Cain and Seth, and you can look it up in Wikipedia. If you look at the names of the people, of the generations of Cain and the generations of Seth, essentially they've got the same names. They're a little mixed up, they're a little different, but they're basically the same names. And so we're supposed to assume that these two brothers who were mortal enemies, essentially, because Cain was the murderer and Seth was the good guy. Oh, sorry. Seth was the remaining son, wasn't he? Because Abel got killed. So he was supposed to have given rise to some children. But if you look at it, it's ambiguous, and it looks like Seth may have actually either not existed or he never gave rise to any sons. If we look at Lamech, who was the father of Noah, there are two Lamechs, and the Jewish encyclopedia, there is one Lamech and two traditions. So there's a mystery there. Anyway, so Noah was really a son of Cain, and so the whole Bible is the story of the generations of Cain. It's not the story of the whole human race, but Cain and his descendants desired to enslave them, and it's the story of those people, the city builders. And so the pagans, the people who live in the country, pagans are basically the country folk, and the city are the not country folk, the tyrants, I suppose you might call them. Okay, I don't know how much time I've got left, but basically Jesus had missing years. So even in the Bible, he had missing years, and people speculate whether he went to India or maybe he went to England. And I would suggest that, yeah, he did. He went to either one of those places, and he learned about paganism. He learned, because paganism includes the common law and alchemy. And so the story of Jesus is a man who went away from the Jewish kind of not patriarchal, sorry, that's the wrong word, the Pharisaical culture, the culture of the Pharisees, who were essentially running a civil law kind of arrangement where they decided what the law was. So it's the law of the elites. The Pharisees are the elites, and they set the law, and everyone has to do what they say. Jesus, he grew up, he went away to a pagan culture where this isn't the way it works. The people make the law. And in fact, you don't even need a lawmaking body in a pagan culture because the law is made by the people. This is what the common law is all about. And so Jesus went away. He went to a pagan culture. He learned how much more equitable and fair and decent it was, and he tried to bring it back to the Jewish people that he was part of. And they didn't like it, basically. So that's the story of Jesus. I'm going to have to stop now because I have a really dry mouth. That'll do for an opening statement. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Veritopian. And so now we will switch it over to John, who is remind me, John, if you can. Thanks for being here. So it's always an honor. Would you consider yourself Orthodox Jewish?
For the most part, yeah, Orthodox Jewish, Hasidic, modern Orthodox. I don't really get into particular labels, but yeah, Jewish is good enough for me.
You bet. Thanks so much. And the floor is yours, John.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. And congratulations for the first time streaming. That's cool. That's cool. And I think you had me on like 6 months ago, maybe a little more than that. And I have to say, James, congratulations. You had only like 9,000 subscribers at I think 13,000. Now you're really moving forward, and it's great to be on the channel, and it's great to be talking to Jonathan once again from last time. And so my position of who Jesus was, for the most part, I think that for the most part it's just a gathering of different belief systems and sort of synchronization into the Jewish belief. So it's like different for the most part, right? But I do have a soft spot, and I'm willing to listen, and I have been listening for those who are trying to put the position that no, he was a real guy, a real dude to exist. So I have a soft spot for that, and I hope to be convinced or have my mind at least changed somewhat in today's debate. So I'm looking forward to that. So, I mean, just for the most part, from my position is that once I really learn, Roman history or what happened during the first century, and we all have our biases. We're all going to pick our books, and I'm not going to lie and say that, I'm not going to be biased, but from the Talmud, I get a belief from, actually, matter of fact, it's Gittin 56b, which is ironically the one that people who kind of bash on the Torah will use for us hating Jesus. But actually within that passage, Gittin 56b, it talks about Titus, the emperor of Rome, who was at the time the general, and he conquered Jerusalem, he conquered the temple, and it says that he went into the temple, he took his sword, and he cut the curtain in half. He destroyed there's a curtain that separates the Holy of Holies from the sanctuary, right? So the sanctuary is kind of like where they gather, the people gather, and then there's like this curtain with the room that separates the Holy of Holies, and only the high priest can go in there. So it says that he went there, he cut the curtain in half. Well, that's according to, what we believe as Jews, and this is somewhat comparable to Roman history and Jewish history, what happened in the first century. So am I supposed to believe that that's not really what happened, or am I supposed to take the New Testament's account that, Jesus was crucified and then somehow the curtain was cut in half, and then there's a separation between of course this theology goes into it, Jew and Gentile, it's like an allegory, okay, but what am I supposed to believe? Like in a historical account of a conqueror, of a general of an army who destroyed the Jewish people and the Jewish temple, right? Am I supposed to go with the historical account, or what the religion of Christianity tells me, that Jesus Christ died for my sins and the curtains, cut in half? This is just one of many examples of why, just doing my research and actually trying to find like what really happened, who he was, right? So this leads me down, now I'm starting to question, now this is when I was a Christian, by the way. I used to be a Christian. I used to believe, and then I did research. I wanted to know what really happened. I really wanted to know proof of what I was believing. And then once I learned this, and I over time, generally little by little, I changed my position, and I came, actually, ironically, I came to convert to Judaism because I found more overwhelming evidence for Judaism than I did for Christianity, give or take, whatever. So, that's just one of many examples, and we can continue. So again, like I say, I have a sore spot for Jesus Christ being a real historical person. And I heard people once told me that maybe he was, like Tim actually talked about it, that he left the Pharisees and he went and joined other groups. Some people believe that he became Ebionites. I think that's what they called, Ebionites. They were a sect of Jews that actually lived in where the Dead Sea Scrolls were, right? I don't remember the exact name of the group that it's off my top of my head. Ebionites or something like that. So, it's possible. It's possible that he was part of a group, and there was a man here who thought he was a Messiah. He led others to believe this. Josephus, I think, divine disbelief actually quoted Josephus. Josephus actually lists countless numbers of people during the first century who thought that they were the Messiah. Matter of fact, the screen name that I go by on the internet, John Gishla, Levi ben Gish, was actually a Masonic figure. He led a revolt against the Romans, same time Jesus lived. So why can't I believe that he was a real historical person? Maybe he was the Mashiach. So it's up to us. It's up to us to decipher and to choose what we believe, and hopefully we can come to a conclusion. Thank you for letting me speak, and go ahead.
You bet. And with that, we won't waste any time. We're going to jump right into the open discussion. But I do want to mention, folks, if you have a question for the Q&A, we'll have a short Q&A at the end of 25 minutes. Shoot that question into the live chat. And if you tag me with @ModernDayDebate in that same live chat, that'll help me so I don't miss it. Also, Super Chat's an option. Super Chats will go to the top of the list. And also, you can make a comment toward one of the speakers. We, of course, ask, though, be your friendly, usual selves. And if you do make any comments toward one of the speakers. So, thanks so much. And the floor is yours, gentlemen.
Well, thanks so much. Maybe I'll go first since there was an awkward silence. And let me direct my first comment to John. As an Orthodox Jew, what do you make of passages in the Hebrew Bible which I think detail in a lot of, or give an account in a lot of detail of the mission of Israel's Messiah, which I think fits much better with Jesus of Nazareth than any other individual. For example, Isaiah 52:13 through Isaiah 53:12. I'm sure you're very familiar with that text. What would you make of that?
I think there might be an echo. So sorry. Does anyone if anyone happens to have their browser with the watch page on, if you're able to mute it just in case. It might be just me. I definitely.
So from a Jewish, so headphones is always the best. So just from my perspective, from an Orthodox perspective, we understand that there's Torah, so it's the Word of God and the commandments that go along with it, and then there's additional beliefs that attach to it. So, things like resurrection of the dead is not in the Torah, but we believe in it as Jews. And the same thing goes for the Mashiach. What happens to us when we die? Do we go to heaven? Do we go to hell? So the afterlife, that's an optional belief. It's not a fundamental principle of Judaism. Yes, has Judaism developed and continues to develop throughout the ages? Absolutely. But for my position is, well, what does the Torah say? What does God think about it? Because I think what God says, God's opinion is what matters the most, right? So if God doesn't speak about a Mashiach, not in the 5 books of Moses anyway, people can nitpick and say maybe this is a reference, but we find that mostly in the prophets. So that would be my answers. There's in the prophets, yeah, sure, there's messianic prophecies and all this, and we can, maybe it's Jesus, maybe it's Joe, maybe it's this guy. But at the end of the day, it's an optional belief, and whoever you choose to be the Messiah, whoever you think is the Messiah, that it's not necessarily makes or breaks the belief system.
Well, I would like to cut in if I can. The thing about messiahs is it's very much an Abrahamic kind of concept in paganism. People are able to attain godhood, if you like, or enlightenment. Many people are able to do it. Anyone can do it. In fact, it's open to anyone. And this is one of the fundamental differences between paganism and Christianity, is that the ability to attain enlightenment is reserved only for Jesus in Christianity, whereas in paganism, it's open to anyone. So in that sense, I would argue that Christianity is a neutered form of paganism. It's lost its power because it denies the personal apotheosis, which is enlightenment. Yeah, I'd just like to.
I just want to add a point real quick. Cyrus the Great, who wasn't Jewish, was also considered the Mashiach. So right. Technically speaking, a non-Jew could be Messiah, just not the Messiah.
Right, absolutely. And there's different individuals in the Hebrew Bible who are called by the title of Mashiach or Messiah. But there's also this concept of King Messiah, and I'm sure you're aware of that distinction. But I mean, so from what you said, I would gather that you're Torah only. Is that correct?
I'm not Torah only. I believe in all of Judaism, but the distinction, I make a distinction that Torah is the absolute word of God, and everything else is secondary to that. That's the distinction I make.
Okay. So what do you make of? So do you consider Isaiah to be a prophet?
Sure, of course, yeah.
So Isaiah 52:13 to Isaiah 53:12, and what do you interpret that to be talking about?
Just what's the one of the pierce for our transgressions? Which one is that?
Yeah, correct.
Right. So that I take that to believe. Well, I mean Isaiah. I mean the chapters before and the chapters after clearly reference that Isaiah is talking about the Jewish people, Israelites, Hebrews, Jews, whatever you want to refer to them as. So I take it as he's speaking about the Jewish people are the ones being prosecuted.
So you said that you can derive that interpretation from the context of the chapters before and the chapters after. Can you give specifics?
You would have to read the whole reference.
Give me one example that would point in that direction.
Just the way Isaiah opens up the book of Isaiah. I mean, okay. How does Isaiah open?
Specifically?
I don't want. I mean, this is going to be kind of boring if we're just going to read off the, read from the Bible.
You said that the context of the chapters before and after Isaiah 53 help us to decipher that the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 is.
So what? So let me ask you this question then: What exactly changes then? If Isaiah all the way up to chapter 53, Isaiah is speaking about the people of Israel. Why all of a sudden that he's now particularly talking about an individual?
Well, there's individuals that are referenced in Isaiah. Cyrus, as you mentioned, is an individual as well. I mean, just because the book of Isaiah has Israel as a focus does not mean that there are not individuals who appear throughout the book of Isaiah. And indeed, I would say that the context actually supports my interpretation that this is a messianic text. I mean, I can give specifics as well. for example, Isaiah 42 describes the very same servant and actually contrasts that servant with the nation of Israel. So, I mean, how would you deal with that from within your interpretation?
What's your question? I'm sorry. I'm actually Googling Isaiah, and I'm reading Isaiah as I'm talking to you.
Yeah, of course. So Isaiah 42.
Isaiah 42.
Isaiah 42, verse 1 and following says, "Behold, my servant whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I put my spirit upon him, who will bring forth justice to the nations," etc., etc. And up to verse 7. And then in the second half of the chapter, starting from verse 18, it says, "Hear you deaf, and look you blind, that you may see. Who is blind but my servant, or deaf as my messenger whom I send? Who is blind as my dedicated one, or blind as the servant of the Lord?" And it's speaking there about Israel in context. And so you actually have the servant, the righteous messianic servant, contrasted with the nation of Israel. And there's very strong evidence that this servant spoken of in Isaiah 42, the righteous servant, is the self-same servant as that spoken of in Isaiah 53. And so that, I think, undermines your interpretation that the servant of Isaiah 53 is the nation of Israel.
It's just one of many. I mean, that's the basic. I don't want to hog the conversation, but that's a basic mainline Jewish belief, is that it's talking about the people of Israel as a whole. I mean, there's people that believe that it may be talking about Isaiah himself.
Well, actually, in the time before Jesus, the mainline Jewish interpretation was that it was Messiah. I mean, the interpretation that Isaiah 53 is about the nation of Israel is a very modern interpretation. At least it became popular in modern times.
Well, they wouldn't have read Isaiah. I mean, if we're talking about Jesus's day, they would have been familiar with the Torah. They wouldn't have been reading Isaiah.
No, people of Jesus' day read this enough, which is the whole.
It would have been public reading of Torah.
We can come back to this, I promise, but just to kind of bounce around and get Nathaniel and Veritopian's points or cases in as well. I promise we'll come back to this, but Nathaniel or Veritopian, if there's anything that you had come to mind during this, floor is all yours as well.
Yeah, I've had a few things come to my mind. Thank you, Stephen, in the chat. You're not wrong. And I think Bo Pelini is at LSU now, though. I forgot to mention a couple of things in my opening. I do believe that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate, who I think that we can say certainly existed as well. We have some physical evidence of that. But I would say that he was also crucified for claiming to be the king of the Jews, not because he claimed to be a god. And I think that's attested in all of the Gospels as well. Tim, I heard you say that Christianity is a pagan religion, and I don't think that's true. I think it's the opposite of a pagan religion. In fact, that was a big deal in Rome regarding the reasons that, and if we even look at the things like in 312 to 326, prior to Constantine, who we can argue probably shouldn't have been Caesar, but whatever, saying, adopting Christianity as his own outside of the three visions that he supposedly had. It certainly was, I would contend, is absolutely not a pagan religion.
I would agree with you. In the sense that its spirit is not pagan. The spirit of paganism is freedom. There's no central pagan church. We don't have a holy day. You don't go to church on a Sunday or anything like that, because there's no centralized earthly manifestation of paganism. It's all nature. So Christianity has all of the trappings of paganism. It has the same holidays, or a lot of the same holidays. It has the same symbols. It has a lot of the same philosophy. I could demonstrate, for example, what the essential character of Jesus or Christ is logos. But logos is a pagan concept. It comes from Hermeticism. It's ancient. In my understanding, the Christ spirit, the logos, is the spirit of logic, and it's the process by which all of creation was made. Everything was made by logic, cause and effect, and so on. So Jesus, he wasn't logos. He was a man who became logical. He gave up all of his ideologies. He gave up the things, the emotional attachments to childish ideas, the things that make us feel good about ourselves, and he just was basically factual about reality. And if you are completely logical and honest about everything, it leads you to God anyway, and it leads you to the truth. So,
Well, I don't
that's what
agree
he
with
was.
that. I don't
So-
agree with that at all. Hi there, atheist here. I don't agree with that at all. But who are the other gods of Christianity then, and even of Judaism?
I don't understand the question.
Well, if we're talking about paganism and the pagan gods, I would like like how are they? What are the names? How are they worshipped and things like that? Like
I like the notion. Well, I just want to jump in real quick and ask Tim. I don't know the YouTube channel that he goes by. It just shows up as Tim here. Is that okay? I call you by your first name. I don't want to. Okay, cool. It does make sense. Like if you just read the Gospels, just off the cuff, it does seem like Jesus is this free spirit type of person. Oh, just sell your belongings. How do I achieve enlightenment? Oh, you got to give up everything. Be one with God. It does seem like that. It does seem like that. But to go with the point, what would be the other gods of what his question was like? Since if you're saying it's a pagan religion, then what would be the other gods that are associated, the pantheon, whatever you want to call it?
Well, I'm not sure I'm really saying that. I'm saying that it has the most important elements of paganism, but I'm not necessarily saying it has the polytheistic part of it. The most important parts of paganism for me are the apotheosis. It's the structure of reality. So the God, logos, time kind of thing, and how you can construct a reality from ideas, which is what God has done. I'm sorry, I lost my my thread there. What was your question again? Oh, about the many gods in Christianity. Yeah, it doesn't really happen. I will admit that. But it did take all of the trappings from paganism, such as the festivals, the cross, the concept of the guy on the cross, which is essentially the same as Odin on the tree of Yggdrasil. It symbolizes sacrificing yourself in order to attain spiritual enlightenment, essentially.
Well, I would agree that the story of Jesus is one of many of the dying and rising gods of ancient Near East antiquity. With that being said, I would even ask you, Tim, do you what are, if you don't mind, some of like the practices that you have, or some of the gods that you would say that you believe exist, or that you would worship, or in some way deign some power to, that have some correlation with the Jesus mythos?
Okay, well, we can start with the very first line of Genesis, which is, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, which by my understanding is God created yin and yang, or actually the other way around. Heavens is yang, earth is yin. Because later on in Genesis, a few verses later, he then goes on to create the heavens and the earth again. And so it doesn't really make any sense if you read it in that way. But if you read it in a Taoist way, it does make sense. Because the whole of reality is made from dualities. Everything is a duality. If we just look at, say, for example, the units that we use in physics, such as distance or time, these things are simple one-dimensional strings between two opposites. So the whole of reality is created from duality, and that is the Tao. That's yin and yang, and they would be called heaven and earth in various traditions. They would be called sun and moon in, say, alchemy. They have many, many different names. Yin and yang, the Tao then go on to create the four elements. And the four elements go on to create the 7 days. And it's kind of all logical. I've kind of laid it out on my website, which is currently offline. Sorry about that. Anyway.
That happens. No, thanks. I was just wondering, because I think that my understanding of paganism is a little bit different than what you've kind of brought to the table. So I was confused when you mentioned a couple of things there, and I just really wanted to make sure that I wasn't wrong, and so I appreciate the explanations that you provided. It's still a bit confusing to me, but certainly something that I can probably look more into.
We can see, for example, the four elements is in Ezekiel's wheel. So the story of Ezekiel's wheel in the Old Testament is basically the four elements, and then you've got obviously the 7 days of creation. As far as I know, the Christians don't have any explanation for what the 7 days of creation are. The seven spirits of God are mentioned in Catholic stuff, and obviously they do correspond to what you would call the seven chakras and stuff, but there's a lot more detail there, and actually it creates a completely logical hierarchy of gods, if you like, of essentially this is like Platonic essential ideas, the essential concepts that must exist in order for God to create reality. So the first thing he must create is true and false, is duality. The next thing he creates is the four elements, because that allows work to be done. The four elements are Thor. Thor is Thor. So Thor's day is Thursday, it's Thor's day. It's all the same thing. So my understanding of paganism is all religions had an original religion, so I kind of consider myself an archaeo-pagan, if you like. So I believe there was an original one world religion, which was what we would call paganism today. It's kind of a polytheistic religion. It's animistic. It's all that stuff. And the remnants of it are still hidden in all of the religions that we have today. But if you put the pieces together with your own logic and actually thinking it through from your own experience, it forms a very clear pattern, which is in fact the grand unified theory of everything that everyone's missing. So the four elements that the scientists threw out many years ago as being a stupid idea and couldn't possibly work is in fact the real theory of everything. It's just that they think that everything comes from matter, but it doesn't. Everything comes from spirit.
Yeah, I kind of like you, and I kind of dig what you're saying. And this is kind of like off topic, but I mean we're kind of like going down the rabbit hole here. But it's cool. It's a good topic. I like it. But if you read Hebrew, if you read Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 in Hebrew, Bereshit bara, that's actually just Hebrew for the term abracadabra. So with the words I speak, I create. So Bereshit bara, and then the word is Shemayim, which is heaven, and then Aretz, which is earth. If you break that down, Shemayim, which is a combination of fire and water, and then Eretz, which is the combination of wind and earth. So you can actually read it, Bereshit bara. God is saying, with the words that I speak, I create fire, water, wind, and earth.
I want to kick it over to Jonathan, just because I know that in addition to that original topic that I kind of yanked us away from, that Jonathan was talking about, in case you have anything to say on this topic as well, Jonathan, just to get you back in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. There's quite a lot in what Tim had to say that I would take serious issue with. For example, I don't think that the concept of logos is a pagan concept. I mean, there's pagan parallels. Logos, Philo of Alexandria used the term logos, and he was, of course, very Jewish. He was a Jewish philosopher. And also a book I'd recommend that Tim read is a book by a South African scholar called John Roning, who wrote a book called The Jewish Targums and John's Logos Theology, where he shows that John's theology of Jesus being divine Logos is rooted in the Aramaic paraphrases of the Old Testament, called the Jewish Targumim. For example, and there's numerous examples I could give. Let me just pull up one example. This is from Targum Zuda Jonathan in the Pentateuchal Targumim. And this is speaking about when the Lord God pours his wrath upon Sodom and Gomorrah. And from Genesis 19, it says, the word of the Lord himself. So this is the memra of the Lord. The memra is the Aramaic word for word. The word of the Lord himself had made it descend upon the people of Sodom and Gomorrah showers of favor, that they might work repentance from their wicked works. But when they saw showers of favor, they said, so our wicked works are not manifest before him. He, that is the word, turned then and caused to descend upon them bitumen and fire from before the Lord of the heavens. And so you've got the word acting as a person there. And there's numerous other passages that we can talk about where the word is a divine person. And so that's, I think, the roots of John's Logos theology, and I think I could show that to be the case with some detailed analysis. And John Roning, of course, provides such a detailed analysis in his book, The Jewish Targums and John's Logos Theology. The other point, you rightly said that Christians don't have a good explanation for why there's 7 days of creation week. And I would also disagree with you on this. For example, in the book The Temple and the Church's Mission by G.K. Beale, he points out that that there's a parallel between the creation account in Genesis 1 and the Garden of Eden and so forth, and the temple construction narratives or the tabernacle construction narratives in the rest of the Bible. And he points out, for example, that both the accounts of creation and building of the tabernacle are structured around a series of 7 acts, and God said, or and the Lord said in Exodus 25 and 30 and 34. He points out that Solomon took 7 years to build the temple, that he dedicated it on the 7th month during the Feast of Booths, which is a festival of 7 days, and his dedicatory speech was structured around 7 petitions, and hence the building of the temple appears to be modeled on the 7-day creation of the world, which also is in line with the building of temples in 7 days elsewhere in the ancient Near East. Just as God rested on the 7th day from his work of creation, so when the creation of the tabernacle and especially the temple are finished, God takes up his resting place therein. And so J.K. Beale makes I think a robust argument for interpreting the narrative in Genesis 1 to parallel the construction of the temple and tabernacle in ancient Israel. And we know that the ancients often use numbers symbolically. For example, Matthew in his genealogy in Matthew chapter 1 groups the genealogies in blocks of 14 generations from Adam to David, 14 from David to the exile, 14 from the exile to Jesus. And of course, he has to skip over genealogies to make that math work. And so 14 is the numerical value of David's name, and so that's why he uses the groups them into sets of 14. And I think something very similar is plausibly going on in Genesis 1, where it's not a literal set of 7 days, but it's trying to remind us of, or using 7 as a symbol to parallel the construction of the temple and tabernacle. So that's the motivation or the motif I see behind the 7-day creation week of Genesis 1.
May I respond?
Mm-hmm.
The 7 days that I perceive are not based in any literature or any writings of man. They are built into yours and my body. It's a physical fact. So you have your brain here, which runs on fire. It runs on plasma. It's an electrical organ. Here you've got your lungs, they run on air. Okay, then you've got your stomach, that runs on water, and you've got your legs, that runs on earth. In between fire and air, I have voice. Okay, in between air and water, I have my heart. In between the water and the ground, I have sex. And all of these things are combinations of the two. So this is fire, this is air. When I speak, I am breathing fire. I am voicing my law. I'm speaking my law. So I'm speaking my will. I'm turning my will into air. My heart combines air and water and pumps it around my body so that I can live. It's the organ of power. Obviously, sex is a combination of earth and water. It's the same as the salty oceans. That's what the origin of life. It's earth plus water. And these are the 7 centers of your body. And this is a factual reality. This is way beyond any kind of speculations about people's tombs or whatever it was, David's thingamajigs, his name and his numerology. This is something that anyone can observe, and it's part of nature, and you don't need to refer to the Bible or anything in order to observe it. So that's it.
Gonna talk about Jesus because
Yeah, can we move back to the topic?
I just can't.
Okay, yeah, so let's get back to the topic. The topic is that Jesus was trying to bring the law to the Jews, the true law, the law of God, because what they had was the law of man. They were worshipping the creation. They were doing exactly what they were supposed not to do. They had an elite ruling class who made up the laws, the priests who said, oh, in order to worship God, you've got to bring us all of these things. And this is one of the big problems. Anyway, that's history. So we basically have the 2 different schemes that you can have. You can live under the law of God, or you can live under the law of man. You can live under real morality that God created, or Odin, same person, creator, or you can live under the law that people create. And if people create the law, they're going to do it for their own selfish benefit, because power corrupts. This is why having a ruling elite is a bad idea, because if you give them power, you're basically corrupting them. If you give your if you give your duty to other people, if you say, okay, look, I'm just going to let the ruling class make the laws and they're going to take care of our society, then you are giving up. You're giving up your duty, and the only thing that can ensue from that is oh, sorry, I've not explained that very well. The attraction of the statist society is that people don't have to take responsibility for themselves, whereas the opposite, which is the non-state society, which is what Jesus was trying to bring to people, the common law, where you don't actually have to have a ruling class to tell you how to live. You just get the people together, you form a council, and the people can decide for themselves in a temporary council. You don't need any kind of permanent machinery of government. And that is what I think, that's who I think Jesus was. I think he was trying to bring that law to the Jews who were living under Pharisaic law. He was trying to bring them common law.
Okay, maybe we should move on, because I'm interested in discussing the subject of mythicism, which divine disbelief. Remember your name, sorry, I'm blanking on your name.
Nathaniel.
Nathaniel, that's it. Yeah. Yeah, Nathaniel and I agree on rejection of mythicism, and I think Tim also agrees with us on that as well. So I'm interested in John's perspective, because you identify yourself as a mythicist. How would you square that with some of the argumentation I provided in my opening statement?
What about my opening? I did it too.
Yeah, we'll come to you as well.
No, I was like, we both brought it up.
Yeah, I mean, I know that. I know that Nathaniel and I both agree that Jesus existed as a historical person. So I want to push back on John in regards to that, and then I also want to talk later to Nathaniel about taking it a step further to the actual deity of Jesus. So, John, how would you interact, John, with the argumentation I provided in the opening statement, or that Nathaniel provided?
Fair enough. So, I mean, I'm not really one. I don't really want to quote things like the zeitgeist and stuff like that. But from my perspective, like how I look at it, like it just, for me, like just the similarities of how Christianity promotes Jesus Christ, it just seems so far. It just seems too familiar with other cultures and beliefs that the world has.
Let me pause you there just for a moment, just because you said you don't want to talk about the zeitgeist or things like that. Is that because you recognize it to be a crank production, or because, I mean, do you take the zeitgeist maybe seriously?
I don't want to quote anything because some people, you can disprove things, right? So I mean, like a lot of people find that film to be bogus, right? So I don't want to come off as I speak for myself. I'm saying from my own perspective. Like I find all too often just too many similarities of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Yeah, you can quote Son God, Son of God. There's this Sunday. Huh?
The Bible was not written in English. I mean, the son a pun.
It's based off it's based off of German, right?
A German came later too. The Bible wasn't written in German either.
Well, I mean, it's like what Tim was quoting. Like you have Moon Day for the moon god, and you have Thursday for Thor, right? It's Thor's Day. So I mean, it's just based off of Christianity. It's just now I don't know how much is it. Some people will. I know you're anti-Catholic, so a lot of people will say Catholicism made a hybrid of. Sorry.
I'm not anti-Catholic. I disagree with Roman Catholicism. That's not the same thing as being anti-Catholic.
We talked about that. We talked about that last time, I think, when we were in the show together. But if we're talking about purely of how Christianity is promoted, just simply on the doctrines of Christianity, I can't safely say that it's not paganism. It's not zeitgeist. You know what I'm saying? It's just.
So as I said, I asked a question earlier, and I'd like to ask it again because you didn't answer. How would you interact with the argumentation I gave in the opening statement, such as, for example, I gave 2 examples of a very specific detail that's extraneous to John's gospel, namely Jesus' approach to Bethany 6 days before Passover and Jesus turning to Philip at the beginning of the 5,000 miracle. And these are specific details that only John gives us, both of which we can independently confirm. And so if we can confirm those details, then at minimum, Jesus has to have existed, right?
Oh, well, I would say just because the New Testament is able to give us examples of Jewish festivities and somewhat accurate results of what's actually going on in historic, Passover and Seders and stuff like this. Like, it doesn't negate the fact that most of the other stuff that is based off of comes from an other source, which would be paganism.
That wasn't. I wasn't giving examples of the New Testament getting general things right, like Jewish festivities and so forth. I gave examples pertaining to the life of Jesus, namely that Jesus' entrance to Jerusalem was 6 days. Entrance to Bethany was 6 days before Passover, and entrance to Jerusalem was 5 days before Passover. Jesus himself turned to Philip at the beginning of the 5,000 miracle, and so forth. I gave an example of an unexplained illusion in Mark 15, where Jesus is carrying his cross, and the Roman soldiers compel a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who's coming from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry the cross. That unexplained illusion, where Alexander and Rufus are name dropped, like the audience is supposed to know who they are, makes best sense if, in fact, it is grounded in real historical events.
I have to be honest with you. To be honest with you, I would have to do a lot of research, and we would have to discuss this maybe on privately about how this fits in, because I'm not really familiar of how the day. It's interesting what you're putting forth, and I would have to. I guess it's so minutiae. The minutia of like exactly the days and how they line up is something that I would have to sit down and look at.
Okay,
I don't know generally off my head, like, you know what I'm saying? Not something I hear often.
I'm just curious as to why you're getting yourself into debates when you openly admit that you haven't done any research on the relevant topics.
I mean, you're talking about a minutia of a topic, exactly how many days of, you know what I'm saying? I mean, the general conversation of who Jesus Christ is, I would say I have a fairly relatively good understanding of the topic of who Jesus is. Like, is he the Messiah? Is he God? Was he a historical person? Was he just a figure, mystical figure? Like, generally, which is what we're talking about.
The example I gave from Mark 15 is fairly well known Mark verisimilitude, the one with Alexander and Rufus. I mean, how do you account for those sorts of things within a mythicist framework? They compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Alexander, I mean, when you're making up a story, you try to minimize unnecessary detail.
Okay, but where is that independently attested? I mean, I agree with you regarding the position that Jesus existed, but where is the independent attestation that Simon of Cyrene actually carried the cross of Jesus, or that he even existed?
The point is
where's the independent attestation? You can't bring up something to try to hold on, please. You can't bring up somebody to try to negate somebody's position by bringing up something that has no dissimilarity, that is not independently attested, to try to say to try to say to John, why are you bringing something up here? That's not the way that works, because you need to show how your position is actually valid, and I don't think you can do that with the Markan gospel regarding the passion narrative.
Well, actually, I don't think that independent attestation is the only criterion by which we can investigate history. I think there are other.
No, I disagree entirely, and in fact, I think that most historians and scholars would disagree with you as well. There are three, and I brought them up in my opening statement. They are criterions of dissimilarity, independent attestation, and cultural context.
Well, I mean, for example, the criterion of embarrassment is often used in New Testament as well.
Right? That's not used by any critical scholar. Not a single one of them.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Name one.
I mean, I've seen it plenty of places in critical scholarship. I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I've seen it many places.
Okay.
I mean, for example, in Mark 8, where you have in Mark 8, where it says that Jesus foretells about his death and so forth, and it says that Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, but turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." That twofold rebuke, where Jesus, where Jesus is rebuked by Peter, and or Jesus rebukes Peter, and Peter rebukes Jesus, and Jesus, in rebuking Peter, calls him Satan. Get behind me, Satan. That is something that's very unlikely, especially since Mark is supposed to be based on the eyewitness testimony of Peter. That's very unlikely if Mark is simply making things up, because you don't make things up to undermine the credibility of your key figures, or that are counterproductive to your cause. And so when a particular fact is embarrassing or awkward to the authors, it's probably true. And in fact, I'll give you an example in critical scholarship where the criterion of embarrassment is used, and that is with the discovery of the empty tomb by women, in fact, that's one of the main reasons that compels many critical scholars who are otherwise skeptical of the resurrection to nonetheless subscribe to the idea that the tomb was found empty on the Sunday morning, because the testimony of a woman was not highly regarded, and so the fact that the tomb is discovered empty on the Easter morning is taken to be most plausibly historical, because any later account that was at liberty to make things up would have had male witnesses be the chief discoverers of the empty tomb. And so the best explanation then is that the gospel authors report what was for them an awkward and embarrassing fact. That is a principle that's used in critical scholarship in regards to the New Testament.
Yeah, okay. Who did the women go and get? Well, except for the Gospel of Mark, we can't use that one, obviously. But who did the women go to get?
So Mary Magdalene goes back to tell, after discovering the empty tomb, she goes back to John and Peter and the beloved disciple.
Well, Peter and the other disciple that's not actually, and one of them that's not actually named, but the one that he beats Peter in a foot race.
I would interpret that as John, son of Zebedee, but that's another discussion, but sure.
Yeah, it is, because, again, I don't know anybody that agrees with that. The one that beat Peter in a foot race. Yeah, and so they actually, it mattered because they went and told the men, which is why that mattered. It's not embarrassing because they went and told the men. But I did ask earlier, I mentioned, how many of them were convinced by the empty tomb?
In terms of number, I don't know what
How many of them were convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead because they went to the tomb?
Are you talking about the women?
I'm talking about literally anybody in the New Testament.
Well, no. I mean, when people discover the empty tomb, they're confused. Mary Magdalene in John chapter 20 wonders where the body's being taken, for example, and so they assume that the body's being moved or something like that. It's the resurrection encounters with Jesus, where they actually witness Jesus raised from the dead. That's what compels belief in the resurrection.
So you would state that Jesus believed he was God, right? Okay. So, and if his disciples and the people around him that were closest to him would believe that he was God as well, why did none of them believe that he had risen from the dead?
Well, it was counter to their Jewish beliefs concerning the afterlife. N.T. Wright wrote a 900-page book on this topic called The Resurrection of the Son of God, where he surveys the belief concerning the afterlife among the Greco-Roman world and also among the Jewish world. And he concludes that, the two major sects of Judaism were the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And as you know, the Sadducees didn't believe in any resurrection, and the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the end of the world. So they had this. So the idea of a first fruits resurrection of one man to glory and immortality in the middle of history was something that was surprising and unexpected.
Okay, but Jesus did tell them that depending on how you interpret Son of Man, was going to rise from the dead on the third day, right? Like in all of the books, he predicted that.
Yeah, and the Gospels also tell us that they didn't understand exactly what Jesus meant. For example, in John chapter 2, after Jesus has just predicted the resurrection from the dead, it says,
guys, what is this really telling us about Jesus?
Well, I'm trying to lay the foundation that Jesus didn't believe he was God, and neither did anybody that was around him.
So do you believe that the Gospels represent Jesus as being God?
I believe the Gospels do, yes, but I don't believe that Jesus believed he was God.
And do you believe that the quotations of Jesus in the Gospels portray him as God?
I would say that likely 18% of the quotations are actually of Jesus.
Okay, but that's a
And-
different question. So first
And
question.
then I would, okay, no, I don't believe so. And you can quote the 4 in the Gospel of John, and I can tell you how they don't meet the criterion of anything.
Okay, I can talk about the Gospel of John, or we can talk about the Gospel of the Synoptic Gospels. We can talk about the Gospel of
I would appreciate if you could bring up one time in the Synoptic Gospels where Jesus claims to be God.
Okay, I'll give you.
I just want to. I'm getting kind of lonely over here in
Oh,
Siberia.
sorry, man.
Oh,
sorry.
No, but you kind of I like Divine here. He brought up a interesting point. Were you saying that you don't exactly know how much of what Jesus says in the Gospels is actually quoted by him?
Correct. I would say that it's likely that about between 80 and 85% of the quotations that come from, especially from the Gospel of Q, which you guys know is the sailing source, are likely not things that Jesus said. I believe that he probably didn't say much of anything in the Gospel of John. So
let's. I mean, I'm happy to talk about the Gospel of John. You asked you challenged me to give you an example from the Synoptics, so let's give you one.
sure.
I can give you numerous from the Synoptics, but here's one example. Matthew chapter 11. When Jesus had finished instructing the 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in their cities. Now, when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word to 5 disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" And Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me." So here, just in setup, we have John the Baptist sent disciples to Jesus to ask him, "Are you the Messiah we've been waiting for, or should we wait for another?" Verse 7. As they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds concerning John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Behold, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. Let us see, of whom it is written, Behold, I send a messenger before your face, prepare your way before you." Which is a quotation directly from Malachi 3, verse 1.
Yeah.
And in Malachi 3, verse 1, we have a forerunner who is whose job is to prepare the way for Yahweh himself. The Hebrew is Ha-Adon, which is a title only ever used of Yahweh. I'm sure John can back me up on that. It's a title only used of Yahweh, and so the messenger is preparing the way for Ha-Adon to come to his temple. And so the context of Matthew is John the Baptist is asking, "Are you the Messiah we've been waiting for?" Jesus says yes, and in fact, look at the evidence, the miraculous sign you see. And in fact, he then goes on to say, after they've gone away, that John the Baptist was that messenger from Malachi who was sent to prepare the way for me.
Cool. What does Messiah mean in Jewish tradition?
The one who would deliver his people.
The anointed one, right?
The anointed one, Christos, Mashiach, yes, anointed one.
The anointed one. Does it ever mean God?
Yes.
In what context does Messiah mean God?
Messiah never mean it. Items. Items are the mishpeach of the temple is considered a Mashiach.
We got to give
the thing that you slaughtered the animals on.
Just so we get a chance for Jonathan to answer that initial question from Nathaniel, and then I promise we can come back to you, John, as well.
So the title Mashiach does not mean God; it means anointed one. However, in the Old Testament, the King Messiah who's envisaged is clearly God. I'll give you one example. If we go to the book of Zechariah, chapter 9, from verse 9 to 11, and this is speaking about King Messiah. I think John would probably agree with me on this. "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will cut off the chaff from Ephraim and the warriors from Jerusalem. And the battle bow should be cut off, and he shall speak peace to the nations. His rule shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. As for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit." Now, so here we have Israel's king riding into Jerusalem, saddled on the back of a donkey. In chapter 14, when you have a description of the coming day of the Lord, when all the nations are being camped against Jerusalem, and then the Lord comes himself to fight against those nations. That's when he fights on a day of battle. And verse 4 says, "On that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem." So and then we see that Yahweh has physical feet. And we get to verse 9, and it says, "And Yahweh will be king over all the earth." And that day Yahweh will be one, and his name one. So we just saw in Zechariah 9 that the king over all the earth, from shore to shore, from sea to sea, is the Messianic king. Here in chapter 14, it's Yahweh himself. And just to further nail the point home, in the book of Zephaniah, which is one book previous, before Haggai and then Zephaniah 3, it says, it introduces this with the same sort of language. It says in verse 14, "Sing aloud, O daughter of Zion, shout, O Israel, rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. He has cleared away your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord is in your midst." So they're the King of Israel, and the same context is actually identified as Yahweh himself. That's just one of many, many examples in the Old Testament, which I think speak to the deity of the Messiah.
Just want to give you guys a 2-minute warning, so we can go back to either Nathaniel or John. I'm sure you guys have a round in the chamber ready to go. I just want to let you know that we're gonna have to go to Q&A pretty quick here, because poor Veritopian has been a sacrificial gentleman in staying up super late with us. As if you don't know, folks, he's over in Europe. So thanks for being here with us so late, Veritopian. But floor is yours, either Nathaniel or John.
Yeah, I just want to say real quick, and I let Nathaniel go. I got 1 minute, and I apologize. I'm not like the biggest expert, and I wish that I would, have the more learning underneath my belt. And one day, maybe. So if I'm the King of England, right, and I hire my faithful slave, my loyal servant, right, he's my best soldier, and I say, I want you to deliver this letter, right? Let's say I'm the King of England, and I say, go to the King of France. Here's this letter, my tablet. I want you to go to him and deliver this for me. That messenger, yes, is a shliach of the king. He represents the king. So yes, he is in a sense the king himself, because he is connected to the king. He delivers the message on behalf of the king. So when the Mashiach comes, and the Messiah, is he literally God incarnate? Is he just a vessel for the message? And the answer is, from a kosher perspective, that the Mashiach is simply a shliach. He's just the extension of God. He's not God himself, but just the mere extension.
Nathaniel, did you have a comment before I respond?
I would agree with John regarding that, and I think it's actually quite obvious that Jesus didn't think he was God anyway, because as I mentioned, in all 4 of the Gospels, Jesus is crucified not for claiming to be a God, but rather because he was crucified because he was claiming to be the King of the Jews. That's why in all 4 of them, Pilate never asks him if he's God. He asks him very specifically, "Are you the King of the Jews?" That's why he was crucified. It was not because he was claiming to be a God. I find it also very suspicious that he would ride into town on a donkey. I don't think that ever happened. I don't think there's no attestation for that anywhere.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you say those things and then you fail to provide evidence for them. I would also have to say that had Jesus claimed to be God, in a time where Caesar Augustus was the only God, he would have been crucified immediately. It wouldn't have been one of those, they picked up stones to stone him, but then he miraculously got away things. The Romans would have crucified him immediately. It would not even have, he wouldn't have lasted even the rest of the day. And so there's, and he also, the book of Mark is very specific when it comes to this. He was an apocalyptic preacher, much like the rest of the apocalypticists that lived then, who believed that the end of the age was coming soon, and that when the Son of Man returned, he was going to be given the kingdom, and he'd be the king of the kings of the Jews. And he was very specific on this, and all you have to do is read the book of Mark to see that. He had an incredible amount of anguish regarding his impending doom, and that's the opposite of what you see when he's super Jesus slapping the shit out of people, walking up and making people fall back by saying, "I am he," right? I mean, there's an incredible difference with that. I'm surprised he didn't walk around and pick up his cross and start weightlifting it in the book of John, which, by the way, he might have. We could read the Gospel of Peter for that. I think that I don't know that you have at all made a strong case. Now, I think that I could also point to John and say that we have the attestation. I mean, Paul himself talked to James, the brother of Jesus, and to the rest of the disciples within a couple of years of Jesus's life, which I think would show that Jesus definitely existed at least. But I don't think Jonathan Wow, there's two Jonathans here. This is hard. I just noticed that. I'm sorry, guys. Where you could say that Jesus believed he was a god, that Jesus was crucified for anything other than claiming to be the king of the Jews, and that he even rose on the third day with claims there that simply can't be attested.
Okay. There's a lot of
Really,
response.
really short and pithy, Jonathan, if you can.
Sorry.
Very, very quickly.
Sorry.
I think you can show from the Gospels that one of the chief reasons, or one of the key reasons that the Jewish leaders wanted him dead was because of his claims to deity. Even at his trial before Joseph Caiaphas in Mark chapter 14, the high priest asks him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am." It doesn't stop there. So he's going to be the Messiah. I am. He doesn't stop there. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the cloud of heaven. A direct allusion back to Daniel 7:13, where you have the Son of Man figure worshipped by all nations and described in the very same terms that Yahweh is described in the previous chapter in Daniel 6, verse 26. And in fact, the high priest gives the appropriate response. He tears his garments and said, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all proclaim. They all say he's worthy of death. And so I think there you have the deity of Christ clearly. I'll finish there unless there's anything in particular from what you said you want to press me on, because I know we want to move to Q&A.
You got it. Thanks, gentlemen, very much for this interesting conversation. Super fun to get to have all four perspectives represented today. So this has been one for the record books. I don't think we've ever had such a diversity of perspectives in one panel or discussion. So with that, we'll jump into the Q&A, folks. Thanks so much for your questions. If you have any more, shoot them into the live chat with an @ModernDayDebate, and I won't miss them. Steven Steen, thanks for your super chat, you sicko. He says, Nebraska is bad at football. I don't know what this guy's problem is. Sorry, guys. Thanks for that. Next up, I think I saw Nathaniel agreed with him. What's going on there, Nathaniel? You don't like Nebraska?
So I'm a Husker all the way through alumni, and so yeah, right now not great. We'll see.
I get it. Makes sense now. Thank you very much. And then Jim Majors, a sassy fellow, thanks for your super chat. He said, from McLatchie, Mary, Joseph, Herod, the Magi, the shepherds, Simeon, Anna, etc., all knew that Jesus was Messiah and Son of God at birth. Why then did nobody seem to know this later in the narratives?
Because Jesus' family are not the same as the Jewish crowds, so I don't really understand the argument there.
Gotcha. Well, Jimbo, shoot me another. You can just put it in a normal question. I can clarify in case I read that the wrong way. Forgive me. Stephen Smith, thanks for your super chat. He said, can any of you foresee Jesus is possibly a product of Satan, pulled people away from God and made people worship a man? Prayers go to Jesus now, not God.
I'll join in on that one. It wasn't. I'm sorry, I lost it. I'll pass it over.
I don't want to say exactly that he's of the devil, because that's kind of a strong claim. But did he pull people away from Judaism? Yes, because at the end of the day, he didn't bring people closer to the Torah. He didn't bring people closer to the Word of God. His followers formed a new religion, so you can say he was the forefather of a. I mean, maybe not directly, but in so much so, yeah, you can kind of, from a Jewish perspective, sort of, kind of.
Apologies, if I can just interject. I've got my thoughts together. It wasn't Jesus who pulled people away from God. He was trying to pull people towards God. The trouble was that the church co-opted Jesus and his teachings. They diluted them, they changed them in order to make it suitable for the statist religion that it was. And so it was the church that pulled people away from God. The church is essentially anathema to Jesus. It's the opposite. The church does not teach what Jesus taught.
Gotcha. Next up, thanks for your question from Someone's Behind You. Very nice. They said, for all, Buddha, Krishna, Heracles, Dionysus, Attis of Phrygia, Oh, I know I'm saying that wrong. That's embarrassing. Zoroaster. All have similar stories to Jesus that predate the supposed actual story of Jesus. Can anyone explain this?
Yeah, Addis and Cyrene, man, the first of the eunuchs. That's actually my girlfriend's favorite story. Um, yeah, these are the dying and rising gods. Uh, this is something that we would expect to find. This is why the Romans weren't at all surprised about the religion that they saw in Christianity. Moving into Rome right there into the first century, because they had so many of those different like dying and rising god stories, and one could even there are an incredible amount of others that, and I brought this up in a debate that I had back in October as to why it wouldn't even have been surprising to folks outside of Judaism. You forgot Apollonius, by the way, and he was certainly more popular than Jesus in the first and second centuries. And I would say that that's why it's was accepted inside of Rome, because there were so many of them.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Next up, Brian Stevens, thanks for your question. He said, where outside of the Bible does someone use the criterion of embarrassment? So I think they're asking for, like, outside of biblical historical studies, where do people use the criterion of embarrassment?
I'm not sure. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. But even if it wasn't used anywhere else outside New Testament scholarship, so what? If it's a valid principle, I don't see the problem. There are, different fields of historiography can well have different methodologies that are employed within that field. So I don't really see that as a potent objection either way.
Yeah, no, I would agree. These criterion, even though dissimilarity and things like that, are almost specific to New Testament scholarship. So,
gotcha. Thank you very much. And Brian Stevens, thanks for your other question. They said, women were known to go to the tombs to put oil on the bodies. Wouldn't the story be less believable if men went to the tomb in the story? I think they mean, like, if men went to the tomb and were the first to see Jesus rather than the women, wouldn't that be, like, less believable because people would expect it to be the women because that was kind of a role women often did in that time?
Jonathan, if you go ahead, because I was like, I can take that or you can.
The point is that the criterion of embarrassment as applied here is that if it was later people making up the story of the empty tomb, they would have undoubtedly made male witnesses that he discovers the empty tomb, because the testimony of a woman is not highly regarded. Their testimony is worth approximately half that of a man or a male witness, and their testimony is not considered credible, and so it's an argument for the veracity of the empty tomb narrative. You have a point, Nathaniel, to raise?
Yeah, I obviously disagree with that, and as much as I'm not the biggest fan of Richard Carrier, I think that he makes a great case against that. But I would say that the men showing up first, there's a reason Mary Magdalene showed up first, but that's a whole nother conversation. But I would say that the men showing up first actually would have provided independent attestation, and it would have provided dissimilarity as well as cultural context. And I believe that it certainly would have added more veracity to the claim. But there's a reason Mary Magdalene showed up first. So,
gotcha. Let's see. Do I understand it? Just for clarity, I totally get what you have said, Nathan, or Nathaniel. Sorry about that. And then Jonathan, were you saying that your argument from embarrassment isn't about, like, saying what you would expect to find, but rather it's more about, like, whether it be at the tomb or anywhere, like if they were going to fabricate this, it would make more sense that they would say men. Is that what you're saying? Because yours is a little bit, it was harder for me to understand.
Yeah, exactly. If they were going to fabricate it, it's more likely that they would have chosen male witnesses. So it adds some weight to the evidential argument for the veracity of the account.
Okay, gotcha. So, like, kind of meta, I see what you're saying. Gotcha. Thanks so much. Interesting from both you and Nathaniel. I hadn't heard of either of those responses before. So, Jay, forgive me if I mispronounce this. Jay Gom, thanks for your super chat. They said, could each debater please state in one word who they think Jesus was, and in one sentence state their best evidence for it? that's an interesting question. I like that. Thanks, Jay. It's a not easy one, but if you guys want to take a stab at it.
Yeah, I can go first if you like. Christ is logic. So logic is the thing that creates the universe. It's the mediator between creation and the creator, because it's the way that the universe was made. So by knowing it, we can know the creator. It's a spirit. It doesn't have a body. Because I was talking about the seven earlier on, this is will. So this corresponds to God. This is voice, and this corresponds to Christ, because voice is choice. Christ represents free will. That's why he has the cross as a symbol, because the cross represents the crossroads. It represents choice. So there you go, choice. Christ is logic, and he represents choice and voice. That's where it's all about.
Gotcha. Thanks so much.
I think that Jesus is the divine Son of God, that he is eternal, that he is the Jewish Messiah, prophesied about in the Old Testament, and the strongest evidences for that would be messianic prophecy and the resurrection of Jesus.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And super chat just came in. Dean Meadows, thanks for your question. They said,
Well, I want to just answer that question. He was looking for everyone.
Oh,
no?
You're right. So sorry about that. Didn't mean to do that to you guys.
No, it's okay. Just one word: idolatry. And the reason for that would be just people look for something other than God to get to define their answers or worship. That would be in a nutshell.
Gotcha. Thanks. And
yeah, my one word would be Jewish, and he was born and lived in first century Palestine.
You bet. Thanks so much. Appreciate that. And then, all right, I jumped the gun. Dean Meadows, buddies of Nathaniel. He's coming for you, Nathaniel. You guys have a good history, a rich, interesting history, like the Rock and Stone Cold in the Attitude Era. He says, Nathaniel, what historical textual evidence would convince you Jesus was the Christ raised from the dead?
Oh, Dean. Anything that passes the three criterion that I've kind of mentioned today, and so far none of them do. What might help though would be something written about the life of Jesus that's not 40 to 50 years after his life would help. Maybe the words of Jesus might help a little bit, like him writing things, which obviously I understand he likely couldn't write, but still, but anything that passes the three criterion, like, there you go.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And appreciate Twitch Loken 16. Thanks for your super chat. They said, does the pagan know a man named Von Helton?
No.
Gotcha. Is that some sort of inside joke? Why are you laughing, John? Okay. So,
I know Von. I'm surprised he doesn't.
Gotcha. You bet. Sigifredo, I don't know who is. Sigifredo is Robbie. Thanks for your super chat. He said, what's the intent for Bible, where I think they're saying, what's the intent when the Bible says Jews are the synagogue of Satan?
Well, that explains, as I was saying, about the whole line of Cain business in the Bible. Because Cain, according to some Jewish stories, was the son of the serpent, the son of Satan. And so I'm sure that John can probably fill more in on that, on the old Jewish mythology about the origin of Cain.
It says in the Zohar that the serpent mated with Eve and they produced Cain as a child. It's from the Zohar. Right,
so the sons of Satan, or the seed of the devil, or whatever, I suppose, that's presumably what they're talking about. I don't necessarily ascribe to that, because that would be against the law in my country.
Gotcha. Unless anybody has anything else, we'll jump to the next question. Gotcha. Next up, appreciate your question from Stephen Smith. They said, why would Christians choose the cross, which represents Jesus' death and suffering, as a symbol for their faith?
I'm not sure who that's addressed to.
Well, they didn't choose it for that purpose. They chose it because it was the original pagan symbol of choice, which is the symbol of logos. That's why they have the cross.
Gotcha.
They did the cross because that's the instrument on which Jesus died. In fact, that's an argument also against John's position, which is the position of mythicism, because the cross became an item of mockery directed towards Christians by both the Jews and the Romans. For example, there's graffiti in Rome with the depiction of a man staring on in adoration at a crucified donkey with the caption, Alexamenos worships his God. Furthermore, in Justin Martyr's 2nd century dialogue with the Jewish rabbi Trypho said to Justin Martyr, "These and such scriptures, sir, compels to wait for he who is son of man shall receive from the Ancient of Days the everlasting kingdom. But this so-called Christ of yours was dishonorable and inglorious, so much so that the last curse contained in the law of God fell on him, for he was crucified." And so it seems very unlikely that Christians would have invented the crucifixion, especially because according to Jewish law, Deuteronomy 21:23, to be killed by being hung on a tree was to be rendered a heretic, literally under God's curse.
Well, if I might add something there, the Christians didn't start using the symbol of the cross until after Constantine saw it in a vision, and then he told them to, and this is the legend, by the way, because it also comes down to the legend of when he saw he saw the sun, he saw Saul, obviously, and he was when they went and they fought, I forget which battle it was, but he said, "This is what I saw in my vision, that I saw the one and only Son of God," and the description that he gave was of the cross of Jesus. And he said, "Put these crosses on your shields, and because God is going to help us to win." And that's what they did. They put the symbol of the cross on their shields, and because they won, that ended up becoming the actual symbol of Christianity. And that's history. That's history from Constantine in 300.
The cross has been around as a symbol since 30,000 years. It's been
Well, I know that, but the question very specifically was when and why did Christians start using it? And that's when and why.
Right. Well, they did it because they had to appropriate the pagan symbols in order to get the people of Europe on board with their Christian religion, which they were trying to force on everybody. So they took as many pagan symbols and put it into Christianity as they could without destroying its essential statist message, so that they could force it on the people.
I'm going to say this, and it's not, but you're wrong, though. Like, you're historically wrong about that.
In what sense? Sorry.
About why they started using the cross as a symbol. It specifically came from Constantine. Because he had a vision. Yes.
Right, okay.
I mean, you can mock it all you want, dude. Pick up a history book.
Well, seriously, I mean, if you're going to believe stuff that was written a long time ago by other people, which is, so far beyond hearsay, okay, that's fair enough. But, you've got to use a bit of logic too.
So, what's your source, Tim? I mean, it seems that a lot of the stuff you said during this debate is just making stuff up out of thin air without any historical sources to substantiate what you're arguing.
Well, it all comes from actually thinking it through for myself. I'm happy to explain it all from first principles to anybody who wants to listen. From the first principles of science, from the things that you can personally know, you can actually work all of this stuff out yourself.
Wow, that was. I've heard some pretty pointed remarks. I don't think you could insult us more than to say that we haven't thought these things out.
I'm not insulting you, mate. I'm sorry if it came across like that. I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that. It's out of the ordinary for people to do this. The way that people tend to work is they look around for other people's opinions on things and they try and synthesize from that. That's the way that the world works. So I'm sorry if it came across as an insult. I didn't mean that.
I would say it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like I don't have necessarily a problem with Christians trying to synchronize different beliefs. Like even with Christmas and Easter, like technically speaking, hanging bulbs on trees and stuff like that. It's just whether or not, Tim, you're right. I mean, or Nathaniel, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, is that question the audience is asking? Was he trying to say like Christianity wasn't good because it adopts different things? But I mean, we all adopt different things, don't we? So why is that necessarily a bad thing or a good thing?
Well, I'm
like
saying
Judaism adopts things. Like Hanukkah is a...
Just so we don't get too bogged down, we probably should jump back to the Q&A. Forgive me, guys, but just Travis...
Sorry about that, James. Sorry.
That's all right. Travis Lee, thanks for your question. For Jonathan, if we can get a yes or no, and you feel free to elaborate if you'd like. They asked, do you think belief in God is properly basic?
No, I don't. It depends what you mean by properly basic. I think that you can make the argument that there's overwhelming evidence in nature such that anyone that denies the existence of God is being irrational. I'm not sure I would say it's properly basic in the sense that I certainly don't believe in the Christian God is properly basic, in the sense that William Lane Craig and others would like to say this is.
You got it. Thanks so much. And we got maybe one or two more. We've got to try to rush through because the poor Veritopian's up super late over there. Sorry. Thanks for your patience. And so Eman Pudama, forgive me if I mispronounce it, correct me. They said, for John, primarily, what do you think of Philo of Alexandria's fusion of Judaism and Greek philosophy, specifically regarding Logos being the firstborn son of God?
I'm to be honest with you, I'm not familiar with Greek philosophy. I'm not not really caught up.
Gotcha. No problemo.
I'm sorry. I apologize for that.
That's all right. You can't. So all sorts of things that'll come up. So you can't know everything on. Can't have read everything on everything. David Druid, thanks for your question. They said, how does one explain that Yahweh is called the Tetragrammaton, which is 4 letters for Atan, the Egyptian sun god, in parentheses?
And as far as I know, all the names of God, it wasn't directed to anyone. So I mean, as far as I know, every name that God has in the Bible comes from a pagan source, like Elohim, Yahweh, Adonai, El Shaddai. As far as I know, they're all from all the other surrounding pagan mythologies. I mean, this is what it goes back to the cross. I mean, you can take something that may have a source, and you can use it for a good purpose. I mean, obviously, that's what the Bible does. The Bible uses these terms and these concepts. I mean, as far as I know, everything in the Bible comes from another source. Circumcision, dietary laws. I mean, you name it. There's other people that surrounded the Israelites that had same principles. The God of Hammurabi is basically the same thing as Torah. So it depends on what you use it for. Do you use it for a holy and good purpose, or do you throw it, for another reason?
Gotcha. Nathaniel, you did not look amused when I read that super chat. Did you want to add anything? You can.
Nah, John did a good job. No.
Okay. You got it. Nathaniel, you remind me of an old friend. Let's see. Love and Light. Oh, wait, we got one from Maynard Sage just popped in. Thanks for your question. They said, Jim Majors 2020. God created marijuana. Did Jesus use marijuana?
Yeah, weed's not indigenous to the Middle East, as far as I know.
It's possible that Jesus didn't live in the Middle East. The location of all of that stuff is.
Yeah, he's from Palestine.
It's questionable.
Jesus was from Palestine. He absolutely was.
Now, what's your source, Tim? I mean, you just pull stuff out of your hat. So this is something.
Okay, one source is Anatoly Fomenko with the New Chronology. Anatoly Fomenko. He's a Russian academic.
I'm looking for a primary source.
A primary source of what, sorry?
Jesus not living in the Middle East.
Well, there's only one source for Jesus, which is the Bible. So
no. I mean, the Bible itself is made up of 27. The New Testament is made up of 27 different books, some of which are independent. We have the letters of Paul, we have the Book of Acts, we have the Gospels, we have other epistles in the New Testament. We also have.
I would also question the timescales as to when he lived and his name. I don't think that you can actually achieve any kind of true knowledge of God or anything by relying on literature and other people's opinions.
When do you think Jesus lived?
I think it was actually about 1,000 years ago.
1,000. But the New Testament was written in the 1st century AD.
How do you know?
Because of the historiographical evidence, it's even quoted from in the 2nd century.
Right, because other people told you, so it's hearsay.
Well, no, come on,
That's-
come on, you're dismissing that. That's nonsense and a fallacy.
I-
But no, you have how many different? I mean, Clement, first Clement was in the first and second century. You're talking about Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny the Younger, Pliny the Elder. I mean, there are an incredible amount of people that lived at that point that mentioned. I mean, you couldn't have had Jesus living in now, mind you, I don't agree that the supernatural stuff, but you couldn't have had Jesus living 1,000 years ago because Constantine lived in the fourth century, and that's when Christianity became the religion of Rome.
And
Guys, I've seen history changed within my own lifetime. To imagine that what happened 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago is accurately represented today is just, it's wishful thinking, really.
so Sam, I want to know from you, what brought you to the conclusion that Jesus lived 1,000 years ago?
If you look at the dates on a whole load of documents, they tend to start with an I. So it would be I or J, as in for the year of Jesus, followed by 3 digits. So say the year 540 would be written as I 540. That's the way they used to do it in old documents. In later documents, they kind of mistook the I as a 1, and I know you ridicule it, but you probably haven't looked into this at all, have you? So,
Oh, come on! Again, that's the third time you said something like that. And I mean, Jonathan and I disagree on
let me
with our
interject a little bit.
conclusion, but for you to say that we haven't looked into it is disingenuous and insulting, to say the least.
Have you ever come across the idea that those dates may have been misrepresented, and with the I's in front of them? Have you ever come across that?
Even if I had,
Right, so you haven't.
even if I no, come on, man. Even if I had, again, I mentioned all these people that lived in the first century. Like,
It's hearsay. You were not personally there. You are relying on.
Thank you,
things that
Ken
other people
Ham.
have
You're
told you.
right. I wasn't there. Jesus Christ.
Okay, so basically what I'm saying is that everything that I believe is based on things that I know firsthand. I don't have to rely on books or opinions from other people, because it's obviously very funny to you over there, Jonathan. But
Well, yeah.
this is the difference between paganism and your fictitious religion,
You're not a
is that-
pagan.
if you say so.
You
Well,
have zero in common with any pagan. You're archaeo-pagan, sure, but you have zero. You can't say that you are this pagan. You're not.
Well, paganism is a very broad church, old chap.
Yeah, and somehow you're not part of it.
I think you'd find actually that I am.
Thank
I
you.
don't know how you would be positioned to judge such a thing.
Thank you guys. We appreciate it. So sorry. I know it's heated. It's like you're seeing my nervous giggle. Let's see. This is enjoyable. It's tense. Anything can happen. So we'll keep on going to the next question. And I don't want to dismiss the discussion there, but it's just to try to get through as many questions as possible. Love and light. Thanks for your question. They said, to Nathaniel, John, and Veritopian, what quote-unquote evidence would make them believe in God or Jesus? And I think they mean like being one and the same, in the, like, loosely speaking, and become a Christian, again in John's case. And they say thanks and blessings from Germany to everyone. Well, thanks for that, love and light over in Germany. So they're asking all three of our non-Christian guests, what would it take to have you become a Christian?
There's nothing that could make me a Christian as the current church teaches it, because it's not logical.
Gotcha.
I mean, simply put, someone would have to show me how Torah changed. I mean, even Jesus says you can't add or subtract to the Torah. So the belief of a Mashiach and who you think it is, or that God is a man, or he dies for sin, these concepts have to be shown. Someone would have to prove that God changed the script on me.
I don't know what it would take for me to believe in a God. I know that it's possible. A multitude of gods could exist. I don't believe any of them do. To accept the claims of Christianity, as I mentioned, you're talking about the criterion that I've mentioned here, along with others. But I don't know what it would take to get me to believe in a God. Feel free to provide some evidence anytime you would like to. But the Jesus and the supernatural stuff, I think that's fairly well explained in the video today.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. We had a couple of quick questions come in. J School account says, Nathaniel, you're a fake atheist, in all caps.
I'm really bald.
Gotcha. The Twitch Loken16 says the pagan wins. You got a fan out there, Veritopian. And then we have another one from Jim Majors. Thanks for your super chat. They said, let's see. There it is. No. It was Brian Stevens who says Jesus was born in 2000 AD. Debate me, Jim Majors. So, Veritopian, you might share. You have a bedfellow there in your 1,000-year hypothesis. So, maybe Brian Stevens and Jim Majors come on and debate whether or not Jesus lived 1,000 or 2,000 roughly years ago. So, thanks for that. And then that's it for the questions that I have in the list. So, I think we hopefully got one from everybody, and then I do want to so Veritopian, because he's been a good sport, we started late, and so I do want to let him get to, this is an interesting question. If I could just really quick, this is just came in. Stripper Liquor did ask, did Jesus kiss Mary Magdalene on the mouth? So I think this is from one of the non-canonical gospels. Jonathan, if you want to respond, you may.
No, unless you're going to provide any evidence for that from primary sources.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And then wait, this is, if I can ask this one too really quick. Maynard Saves, thanks so much. They said, we have Egyptian mummies with cocaine and tobacco found in them. Trade routes long time ago, in their trade routes. With a beard and hair like Jesus, I think he smoked. Why create something so great and not use it? Let's see. So Maynard Saves challenges you, Jonathan. But by the way, Jonathan, congrats on your PhD lately. I saw that on Facebook. You've wrapped up the dissertation and you are officially Dr. McLatchie. So thanks for being here with us, all of you guys. It's been a pleasure. And this has been a wild one. It's always fun, guys. I'm so glad I got to moderate. I almost didn't get to do this, but so thanks again, guys, for being here. And with that, thanks everybody for your questions. It's been a great time. And again, all of these fellows have their links in the description. So if you want to hear more from these guys, you know where to find it. Just right down there in that little description box. So take care, everybody. Have a great day or night.